Hey, I heard JV Bowling did pretty good yesterday. Nice job.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So, yesterday, several of you guys were in live. Thank you for coming. Got, kind of hitting this post-war crazy year 1919, right? And, we start with some labor union violence, and then you have these race riots. Somebody asked a question yesterday about, what kind of spurred these riots, because I kind of describe these riots as different than kind of what we saw in the late 60s, like after Martin Luther King Jr. was, assassinated. We had riots all over the country. There was the Rodney King thing in LA in the 1980s, the LA Watts riots, and these were different. And so one of the things that I read about, and I posted that article, I don't know if anybody read it, was when the war, when the war started, when we started the draft and all the volunteers for the war, 3.5 million men, a lot of those men left jobs to go to the military. And because of the production in our cities, many African Americans started migrating north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, because there were jobs. Okay, because a lot of those jobs were being created because of the war, and some of those job openings were there because other men had gone into uniform. So when those guys got back, okay, some of them couldn't get their jobs back. And some of the African American men that went over and fought, they sacrificed for their country, and now they're coming back home and they're upset because they're being treated like second-class citizens, and rightly so. And so you got a situation here where the tensions began to rise in these cities, especially in the north, where you started to see more and more African Americans than you ever had before. Because most African Americans, obviously, guys lived in the South. And we'll see again a great migration of African Americans during World War II to the north, in places like Cleveland, okay, Indianapolis, all over the Midwest, okay, Pittsburgh, and so forth. So those tensions were running high, okay, and all it took was a little spark, okay. So the case in Tulsa, which kind of hits home, close to home here. They're only about 3 hours away. And this is the 100th anniversary of what happened there. And I was described this yesterday in the lecture about how you had this strong, vibrant, middle-class neighborhood that was mostly African American. And there was a 19-year-old African American male that was accused of attacking a 17-year-old white female elevator operator. They used to have people that would push the buttons for you when, for the elevator. Okay. And so this guy got arrested, but rumors spread like they were going to lynch this guy. So all these white people went down in this neighborhood, and things, fights started, and they ended up burning the whole neighborhood down. Okay. And it's tragic. Okay, and this is what's happening in the summer of 1919. So let's keep going here because it gets worse. All right. So you've got the union violence, you got the race riots, okay, and Palmer, who's kind of, and others. Some of this is true and some of it's not. But this Red Scare over that some of these people that are causing these problems are Bolsheviks, anarchists, and so forth. Some of that's true, but not to the extent really that was the case. You know what I mean? But it's going to be used, and Palmer's going to start rounding some people up and deporting them. So I'm going to come back to this slide in a little while, dealing with unions, okay? But I kind of want to keep dealing with what's going on in 1919, okay? So now we have bomb scares. We have terrorism. And these mostly came in the form of mail bombs, okay? But there was a bomb that went off at the corner of Broad and Wall Street. You guys know what sits at the corner of Broad and Wall Street in Manhattan? Yeah, it's the financial center, the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, that one.
Yes, that's it right here, okay? And a bomb went off there, okay? And it killed 38 people, injuring hundreds. Now, these mail bombs are kind of interesting, all right? You got to play detective here, all right? You play detective and look at the targets of these bombs, okay? First, you got the New York Stock Exchange, but then individuals. Mitchell Palmer's the Attorney General. He's accusing people that are causing problems, calling them Bolsheviks, anarchists, and so forth, okay? Secretary of Labor that deals with labor unions. We've got the union violence, right? J.P. Morgan receives a mail bomb. Now, you guys know what kind of business J.P. Morgan was involved with? Like what he did, what his thing was?
Something with.
Yeah, banking. Yeah, it's like a huge bank, multinational banker, okay? And then Rockefeller, of course, is what? Oil, okay? So play detective here. Look at the targets. Who do you think's sending these bombs? Okay. Would you consider Morgan and Rockefeller's symbols of capitalism?
Yeah.
Would you, the New York Stock Exchange?
Yeah.
Symbol of capitalism? Okay. I mean, if you're putting two and two together, you might be looking for some reds here. You know what I mean? Okay. And guys, the Attorney General of the United States has a bomb explode on his front doorstep. He's going to react. Okay. So I'm going to show you some stuff here in a little bit. Okay. Palmer, the Attorney General, feels like the country is full of anarchists and Bolsheviks. Is it? No. Okay. I mentioned yesterday the letter that he publishes in newspapers around the country called The Case Against the Reds. All right. He's going to start arresting thousands of people that are suspected of being anarchists and communists. And a lot of these people are immigrants. And he's going to start deporting them. Okay, without due process. They don't get a trial. Okay. Now, all of this fear that is taking place in 1919, okay, is going to cause a backlash of sorts against anybody that is deemed different. Okay, now, this is something as Catholics you guys should understand. For most of American history, up to this point, the majority of people in the United States are what you would refer to as WASPs, okay, which is white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Okay. Remember, the first settlers, the colonists were mostly British, yes? Okay. And so with that tradition, obviously, guys, we had Catholics coming in to the New World early on as well. Many of them as indentured servants, okay, that during time or certain times in American history, they didn't have full rights. Other times they did. But anybody that wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon or Protestant, you know what I mean, was different at this time. There's this fear, okay? And so we're going to see these folks as suspicious. And then you add one more to this, and that's immigrants. Okay, and if you look at the history of immigration in this country, it's fascinating to study. Okay, different times, okay, different periods of different mass migration from different countries and so forth. Okay, it is really fascinating. I love it. I love studying that and learning about it. When I went to New York City last time I was in New York City, they have a museum. I have some literature on it, but it's like a flat in New York City. Like, you know, if you ever watched Sesame Street growing up, and they're in New York City, and there's like a staircase that goes up to the house. You know, there are all these houses right next to each other, right? They've preserved one of these, like that has been around for 200 years. Okay, and you walk in there, and you could, like, on the wall, you have the original wall, and then you have, like, what do you call it when you put a wallpaper, okay, from, you know, the 1850s, wallpaper from 1910s, wallpaper from the 1950s, and just, you can kind of see that over time. And then they figured out the families that lived in this house through each of these generations and their last names. Okay, and so you can see, like, at one point this neighborhood was an immigrant neighborhood for Germans. At one point it was an immigrant neighborhood for Polish. At one point it was for Jews. At one point it was for Puerto Ricans, and then blacks, and so forth. Okay, and how this neighborhood had changed over time, and from this one house. It's a pretty cool museum. And you guys studied this a little bit last year, I know, in history, where you learned about how different immigrant populations would come to New York, and they would kind of separate themselves in different neighborhoods. Some of them would move west, you know, once they had enough money, but they would move to places where other people spoke their language. It's a very, very unique place, New York City. It's amazing. I love New York City. But anyhow, this fear of foreigners, okay, and this has a lot to do with where these immigrant populations are coming from at the time of the Red Scare, okay, because obviously Russia, guys, is where the communism ends, right? And then we have the war against Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now we're looking at immigration here. And so these white Protestants are saying, look, we need to restrict immigration. Okay, and that's, you know, fear for, that's xenophobia. Okay, that's how you say that, xenophobia. You guys probably knew that because you're smart. They started creating these different organizations like the Immigration Restriction League that said, okay, if we're going to have immigrants coming in, which is something we've always done, they're going to have to be able to read. Now, I don't know how you guys feel about that individually. The thinking is, if people know how to read, then they will not become dependent on the government or somebody else. They'll be able to take care of themselves and so forth, okay? In 1921, they start setting national quotas. And I think you guys know what a quota is. It's a certain number that's allowed in from each country. Okay, so you get a certain number from this country, a certain from, that's quotas. And then in 1924, they passed the National Origins Act. Okay, so this fear that you see starts to become law, all right? Between 1924 and 29, we only allowed 150,000 immigrants into this country, which is a very low number historically for the United States over a 5-year period, okay? And what this immigration policy does, allowing people of certain national origins, others not, favored Northern and Western European immigrants, okay, and barred all Asians. So what it did what we were trying to do was stop Southern and Eastern European people from coming in, allow Northern and Western Europeans to come in. Now, you look at physical characteristics of a human being. Northern European and Western European people tend to have what physical characteristics different than Southern and Eastern European? Like how they look. Say it. The tone of your skin?
Yeah.
Color of your hair? The color of your eyes? Yes? So as you get down to Southern Europe, you start getting darker skin, darker eye color. Eastern Europe, darker skin, darker eye color. Yes? Is this a racist immigration policy? Absolutely. Okay? Now, I have a graph here. It might be a little bit hard to see, but let me show you. The red is Western and Northern European. The blue is Southern and Eastern European. Okay? So 1880 to 1890, most of the immigrants coming here were from Northern and Western European. 1890 to 1900, it starts to almost be about 50% split. 1901 to 1910, we start to see a lot more Eastern European and Southern European people coming here. Okay? So if you're talking Italians, you're getting a lot of Catholics on you. Spaniards, getting a lot of Catholics, right? Okay? Eastern European, we're talking Russia, okay? Hungary, Bulgaria, places like that, okay? 1911 and 1920, still the majority of immigrants are coming, and this is the 2 decades leading up to the Red Scare and the xenophobia, okay? So what we saw was a lot. Now with the new change in law, you see the switch here. Back to Northern and Western, back to Northern and Western, okay? Any guys have the opportunity to go to Ellis Island? Yeah, well, I brought part of Ellis Island back with me, okay? This is what history teachers do, is they go to places that are historical and they take pictures and they put them in their PowerPoint notes, okay? This is taken at Ellis Island, all right? And this is like on a big mural, okay? I've got a couple more pictures. I'll read this headline from the New York Times, 1924, with the National Origins Act, okay? America of the melting pot comes to an end. The effects of new immigration legislation described by Senate sponsor of the bill, chief aim, he states, is to preserve the racial type as it exists today. Okay, so this map over here is under the present law, under the proposed law. Okay, so prior to the new law, you can see we were getting a lot of Germans. Okay, this is the decade coming into the 1910 to 1920, okay? You can see here quite a few Poles, okay? Obviously Britain and then Ireland, okay? You got a lot of Italians coming in, right? So you got some Eastern, you got some Czechs, all right? And then the smallest number below 1,000 was Spain, so I guess I was off there, in Finland there. And then look, quite a few Russians coming. What's happening in Russia in late, 1917, 1918, right? The Bolshevik Revolution, you got communists now, okay? So now we're going to change that. We're going to cut the number of these people, cut the number of these. Now, Germany, still, you had quite a few coming in, okay? But look, Britain is the only one that gets over 50,000, okay? Italy shrinks in number and so forth. So yes, they're trying to preserve the racial makeup of the United States prior to all this immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, okay? Now, as far as these people maybe being considered as Reds, okay? Reds plotted countrywide something, arrests exceed 5,000, okay? 3 transport ships ready to kick these people out of the country. Were some of these people communists? Yes, I would imagine there were a few in there. I don't know if there were that many. I really don't know, guys. Okay. 249 Reds sail, exiled to Soviet Russia. Okay. This guy Berkman threatens to come back. Second shipload may arrive this week. Okay, this is kind of interesting stuff. Okay. Now, guys, on the Asian front, barring all Asians. Guys, what does this say? What is the U.S. government saying to the Japanese government? To the Chinese government? your people are inferior to ours. We don't want your kind here. You understand? Now, on the west coast of the United States, and I don't know if you guys know this history or not, when we were building the Transcontinental Railroad, you guys know we immigrated Chinese labor. Okay? So we had some Chinese here, not a lot of Chinese, right? And we had some Japanese just by virtue of, the Pacific. You've got Hawaii out there. You have some Japanese population, especially on the west coast of the United States. But guys, this is a racist immigration policy. As far as our diplomatic relations with Japan and China, this is going to affect, our relationship with these countries. It's first of all, it's rude, it's racist, it's kind of ugly. No, guys, do we have the right to do this? Yes, we have the right to do this. We have the right to determine who comes into our country and who doesn't. Okay? And when you have a red scare like this is certainly going to affect immigration. Now, you saw this when President Trump came in with some of those Muslim majority countries. Okay? In some of these Muslim majority countries, there are radical people that want to kill Americans. And President Trump had the right, this went through the courts, to shut down travel from some of these countries. Okay? It's within our power to do this. Now, the reasons why we do it matter. You know what I mean? And that's just something to think about, okay? So understand that xenophobia, and if we talk about xenophobia, do we still have it today? I just brought up the Muslim countries, right? Yes, there's some fear of Muslims in this country, which you would call Islamophobia, okay? But as immigrants, xenophobia. Do we have xenophobia of Mexicans? Fear of Mexicans? I think there's some of that. I mean, our population is very diverse. Okay, it's going to be interesting to see what President Biden is thinking about. I have heard, and I don't know this for sure, what will go down, what happened, but I have heard that he's talking about giving amnesty to around 11 million people. Okay, now I think that has to go through Congress. I don't think he can just do it on his own. Okay, and I was talking to, I think it was Mr. Ferris yesterday, and just talking about some of the new policies and so forth. And let me go ahead and ask you a question. Did you have?
Yeah, well, didn't Reagan do something like that?
Yeah, Reagan did that too, and it was about I think it was about 5 million that people that had been here for like 25 years.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Then is he just doing it randomly, or is he going to do something?
Yeah, I'm not sure. And part of me says, I don't have a problem with this as long as it's done the right way. You know what I mean? I've always felt like, a lot of these people have been here for decades, and they have split families. You know what I mean? You have, maybe a dad that's a citizen, a mom that's not, or vice versa. Kids that were brought over as kids that are not citizens. Your dreamers. How can we split these families up and deport all these people? I just don't think people have the stomach for it. You know what I mean? I probably, you could say it's inhumane. Okay. But I think when you break the law, there has to be a punishment. And so I think a fine of some sort is justifiable. A time period, a path to show that you're going to be a citizen. Start paying taxes. Okay, and a lot of illegal immigrants do pay taxes, but maybe not all of the taxes. Okay, a lot of the money that they make leaves the country because it's sent back to their home countries to help their families back in their home countries, which does affect our economy. So I think it's definitely worth looking at, and I'm not totally opposed to it. You know what I mean? I if it's done right, okay, because we're not solving it. We have this issue for decades, and we're not doing anything about it. Now, people are going to disagree, like on the wall. If you're going to make 11,000 or 11 million people that broke our law to come in illegally, and you don't control your border at this point in time, well, you're going to run into this problem again 30 years from now. So, I don't know, I'm just sharing personal belief here. I think if we can control the border, then we can, but you're creating a new magnet by doing this. You're saying, oh, we're going to let everybody become citizen. Well, people are going to go, I'm going. You're creating a magnet. Okay? We need immigration. We're not overpopulated in this country. We're not. We need workers. We need people because we're not having enough kids on our own. We have to have immigration. Japan is worse than we are. They don't like immigration. Talk about xenophobic. The Japanese are very xenophobic. Okay? I mean, seriously, guys, to be fair to us, we have the most lax immigration in the world. Try to go to Mexico illegally and see what happens to you.
Do they have a stronger border than us? I've always wondered that.
Well, they don't have. We share kind of the border fencing, but no, they just enforce the law. You know what I mean? Like they punish you for breaking the law. They enforce the law. We don't really enforce our laws very well. Okay, which look, it's for some people it's a humanity thing. And look, I don't blame people. Don't blame people for wanting to come here. You know what I mean? I'd want to come here too if I lived south of the border, most likely, unless I had things were set up good for me, down there. But for a lot of people, it's not set up good for them. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of violence. The economic situation is not good in a lot of these countries. I get it, for sure. So, no, I mean, I think we'll keep an eye on what the Biden administration is going to do here, and we'll see. Okay. All right. So we're still getting worse here. Okay. So we got all this stuff going on in 1919. Let's bring the Klan into this. Okay. Now I have up here the South and West. Okay. That's mostly where the Klan was, but it was nationwide. It still is nationwide. Okay. So the Klan, you can see it here, the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Now this I just pulled off the internet randomly. This is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So this just shows you that this was not just in the South, okay? This is a Flag Day Festival, June 14th, 1924. All right? So this is made up of these people, right? Yes? Now, the Klan wasn't always like a terrorist organization or a hate group, okay? It was at some point a civic organization where Christian people, white Protestant Christian people, would gather and they would do good things. They would do charities and stuff like that, okay? And then it has a hateful past as well. I mean, obviously, its birth comes out of the Civil War. I don't know if you guys know this history, like Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, he's kind of the founder of the KKK. It took place in Tennessee. That's where it was founded after the Civil War. Okay. Well, you guys seen Forrest Gump? There's that part. There's a little clip in the movie of Forrest Gump's ancestor, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, who's this? The guy that started the Klan. Okay. So anyhow, guys, just look at this. 4.5 million members in the 1920s. 4.5 million members. Okay, there's a lot of history here. You can go back and read about this, or even watch videos. They had marches on Washington D.C. And they're all wearing the frickin' robes in their frickin' hoods. Okay. This group really started to ramp up its violence and terror against individuals during this time period. Okay. You'll see a rebirth of the Klan again in the 1950s and 60s. Okay. Today, the Klan is a shell of its former self. Okay, there are other hate groups out there like neo-Nazis and so forth. But today the Klan is a joke. I mean, people look at these people as ignorant. They look at these people with disdain. Okay, back in the 1920s, that's not how people viewed the Klan. Okay, and it's good that, you know, people have recognized them for what they are. Okay, which is an ignorant people that are hateful towards others. Okay, so the Klan just kind of existed. It was a civic organization, but often, you know, it turned to violence. So this was this violence against blacks, Jews, Catholics, and foreigners. Okay, they bullied sheriffs, they bullied judges. If you lived in the South, guys, it was really hard if you were, especially African American. So let's say you were an African American and you were a victim of a crime by a white person. So the police reluctantly arrest this white person for this crime against a black person. And then there's going to be a jury of your peers, which is going to be all white. And you don't know if members of that jury are members of the Klan. You don't know if the judge is a member of the Klan. You don't know if the sheriff deputy is a member of the Klan. How are you going to get justice? And the fact is, you're not oftentimes going to get justice in a black on white or a white on black situation. Okay? Things have to change in this country. Okay? And it's going to take a long time. Now, in 1925, the media finally kind of gets on board here and exposes them. The Grand Dragon is the head of a state chapter for the KKK. So who's in charge of your state Klan is called the Grand Dragon. In 1925, the Indiana Grand Dragon was convicted of murder. The newspapers published everything the Klan was doing in Indiana and exposed them for what they had become and what they were doing. This negative exposure of the Klan meant a decline in numbers of people that wanted to be associated with that group. Okay, so that's a good thing, right? All right. So now, anytime there's a reaction, oftentimes there's an overreaction. Okay. How old was he? How old was he? 86. Hank Aaron should just pass away. Baseball. You read a book on Hank Aaron? He broke Babe Ruth's all-time home run record. Babe Ruth hit 711 home runs in his career. Hank Aaron ended up hitting 744. That number was broken by Barry Bonds. Okay. Now, Barry Bonds is not in the Hall of Fame yet. I mean, based on his numbers, he'd be a first ballot guy. After 5 years, you're eligible for the Major League Hall of Fame. He's been out for more than 5 years. He's not in the Hall of Fame. Why?
A scandal.
Or more like
Steroids?
Yeah. I saw Barry Bonds play when he was like in his third year. And he was a skinny little guy. Okay. By the time he finished his career, he was the Hulk. Okay. We had the steroid era in baseball. Okay, where a lot of guys were juicing. All right. When I was in college, there was this dude on I knew a couple guys that were injecting themselves with steroids. Okay. To try and get drafted. Make a lot of money playing Major League Baseball. Okay. Oh, thankfully that era's, a lot of it's over. They test for steroids. So if you get caught, you're suspended for half the season. Half the season, you're suspended. You get caught twice, I think it's a lifetime ban. Maybe a full year, and maybe a third time's a lifetime ban. Okay. So they're taking serious now. All right, sorry. Thanks for changing the subject there. All right. All right. Yeah. So whenever there's a, something like this happens, sometimes there's pushback on the other side. 25. I got time to talk about this, okay? And so I'll talk about unions a little bit tomorrow, okay? I'm going to talk about the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. All right? Show the people at home. Okay. All right. Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Can you figure out where these guys are from?
Italy.
They're Italian. Okay. Now, these two guys, right here, were accused of armed robbery and murder. They were tried, they were found guilty, and they were executed. Now, oh, where you at? Here we go. Once upon a time, Mr. Ebright was a first-year teacher. Okay? And, you know, I went to college back in the 1980s, graduated from college in 91. I started teaching when I was in 1998. Okay, so I had to go back to school to become a teacher because I have a business degree, right? So I took some history classes. High school history was, I graduated in 86. And I took some history classes in junior college back in the late 80s. Now it's 1998 and I'm teaching history for the first time. This was the textbook we used when I first started teaching here. I saved it for 2 pages in here that I like to talk about with my students today, okay? And also to teach you a lesson that I learned, okay? So I didn't remember Sacco and Vanzetti from college. I didn't remember Sacco and Vanzetti from high school. So when I got to this page, I'm 1 day ahead of my students teaching. So I go home at night, try and get some sleep, get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, type up my notes, come in. I'm using the overhead, that machine right there. And I come in and use the Xerox to put it on a clear sheet, and I put my notes up, and then I teach it to the class, go home, get some sleep, get up in the morning at 4 o'clock, type the notes up from the book, and go teach it. So I'm literally like 24 hours ahead of my students. My first year, it's a tough job. And you guys going into education, your first year is one of the hardest jobs you'll ever have. But from there, it goes a little easier, okay? So let me read to you what the book said about Sacco and Vanzetti, because this is what I taught my students. Every epoch in American history has its martyrs. The names enter the folklore. John Brown was the willing martyr in the fight against slavery. Remember John Brown? In this later age, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 2 Italian-born immigrants, became unwilling martyrs in the struggle for equal justice for all. In a 1920 holdup that took place in Boston, Massachusetts shoe factory, a paymaster and a guard were killed. Shortly afterward, Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested. Pay attention. They were both gentle men with no criminal record, but they believed in the philosophy of anarchy. They were tried, found guilty, sentenced to die. There was no solid evidence against them. It was widely thought they were really victims of a frenzied fear of radicals and aliens, xenophobia, and Red Scare. The belief in the innocence of Sacco and Vanzetti was so widespread that in 1927, the governor of Massachusetts finally had to appoint a committee to review the fairness of their trial. But the committee itself was loaded with prejudice. The author of its report was Harvard President Lawrence Lowell, long an officer of the Immigration Restriction League that we talked about on the last slide, who was well known for his belief in the superiority of Anglo-Saxon peoples. It's not surprising the committee reported that the trial had been fair. When Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, millions of Americans mourned. They believed that the 2 gentle Italian immigrants were victims of fear and prejudice. So this goes right in line with what I've been talking about, right? You got the union violence, these are both. You've got race riots. Some of these people are Bolsheviks. Okay. You've got what next? The bomb scares, the mail bomb, anarchists, communists, right? These immigrants coming in, they're trying to start a revolution. And that's why these guys were executed. It was a consequence of what was going on. Now, a couple of years later, doing what good history teachers do, that is read about history. Reading a book called The History of the American People by Paul Johnson. You guys remember the name Upton Sinclair? You ever heard that name, Upton Sinclair? Famous American author. He wrote, his most famous work was called The Jungle. This book is about the meatpacking industry back in the 1910s. And guys, the meatpacking industry, he wrote about how, you know, there were, in the meat that you eat, there's rats in the facilities. There's rat feces, rat body parts in the food you're eating. He said that the working conditions were very unsafe and unsanitary. So like somebody would lose a finger and it would fall into a vat of meat. And this book, The Jungle, just like sold millions and millions of copies. Well, he also wrote a 2-volume novel called Boston on Sacco and Vanzetti. And reading this book, The History of the American People, Paul Johnson describes an interview with Upton Sinclair about his 2-volume novel about these guys, where he proclaimed their innocence in this novel. But during the interview, he said that based on all the research we did for the book, it was very likely that these guys were guilty. Yet he wrote the book proclaiming their innocence. Why would he do that? So people would buy it. Do you think maybe on The Jungle, the book on meatpacking industry, do you think maybe he might have exaggerated some anywhere in there just to like shock value? People don't do that, do they? Then a few years later, guys, I'm reading an article, and there was an estate sale in California. And in this estate sale, one of the person that had died had been one of the lawyers for Sacco and Vanzetti. And they were reading through these letters at this estate sale from this guy that died. And there were letters in there that described how the two men carried out the robbery and murder. These two guys were guilty. Now, based on what I read to you, were these guys guilty? No, they were victims of fear and prejudice. Guys, there were protests all over the world when these guys were executed. Okay? So there was pushback coming the other direction. You know what I mean? So the lesson to me is, like for myself, was, dude, you need to read more about history so you know what you're teaching your students is truth or not. You know what I mean? But the lesson for you, don't believe everything that comes out of my mouth. Because for like 4 years there, guys, I was like, dude, this is awful. You know, what happened to these guys? You know, this is what happens when people get upset and they act like a mob. Okay? And there's some truth to that. But there's also balance. And there's also truth. And there's lies. You know what I mean? So, and we know this, guys, more today than ever before. There was a poll that came out 2 days ago that for the first time, more than 50% of Americans do not trust the media. And can you blame us? You know what I mean? The integrity here is, well, there isn't much when it comes to the news media. We talked about this. It's hard. So always look for more than one source, right? Always, you know. And I try to be careful with that too, guys. Okay? All right. So I'm sure, guys, there are brighter times around the corner. Okay? We're about done with all this awfulness of 1990. Okay? Have a great weekend. Thanks for coming, guys.